Okay, good morning, everybody. On behalf of the Dutch National Knowledge Centre, I'd like to welcome you on this international webinar presented by Dr. Michelle Ronksley-Pavia from Griffith University of School of Education and Professional Studies, from all the way from down under Queensland, Australia. Our topic today is Twice-Exceptional Learners, and as you all can see, different conceptualization of strength-based methodologies and practices for twice-exceptional neurodiverse learners, teachers, and family perspectives. I promise you that Michelle won't talk as fast as I do, but I'd like to get this introduction as soon and short as possible to give the floor to Michelle. Michelle and I met a couple of years ago at an international conference, and ever since we met online quite a couple of times. We saw each other in person, and currently we are on a special guest editorial board for educational sciences for a special issue on gifted education. Michelle, from this point on, the floor is yours. Questions can be asked via the chat. I will moderate the chat. And later on, there is an opportunity for direct interaction. During the presentation, we don't have that interaction straight away because that's the part where I always have to keep in mind that the privacy regulations. So once we start the interactive part, you have to keep in mind if you turn on your camera, you will be recorded and it will be posted on the website of the Dutch National Knowledge Centre. Michelle, from this point on, the floor is yours. It's all yours.
Thank you, Eleanor, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to present to teachers over there in the Netherlands. It's an absolute pleasure. So it's early evening here in Australia, having had a long day of work. I hope my voice lasts for the session and that I can keep it going. So as Eleanor said, I'm going to be talking about some of my recent research around looking at what strength-based approaches for supporting twice-exceptional students in schools looks like from different perspectives. So from the perspective of teachers and from the perspective of parents and families. So I wanted just to start off with talking about how we understand twice exceptionality in Australia. So the two components of twice exceptionality, as many of you probably know, disability and giftedness. But through my research over the last 15 years or so, I've begun to come to the conclusion that twice exceptionality is so much more than these two concepts pushed together. It's very, very individual, depending on the particular individual child, individual student, as we're talking about schools and classrooms. It's not just about their disabilities or their conditions or their neurodivergence. It's not just about their giftedness, their areas of giftedness. It's much more complex than that. It's an interplay of all these different intersectional parts of who these children are. So even though we use labels to help inform our practice and what we do, I found through my research that labels only take us to a certain point in understanding particular conditions, but not how they interact with giftedness for any individual child. So that's framing where I'm coming from with my research in terms of what I'm going to be talking about today. So in Australia, we have different states and territories that have different ways of engaging or not engaging with giftedness. We don't have any kind of national strategy. Some states and territories are doing really good work. They've got really good plans and processes and policies in place for supporting giftedness, for supporting twice exceptional learners. Other states and territories are doing very little, if anything at all. It's quite often left up to individual schools or individual education jurisdictions as to what do they do, and teachers are always crying out for more and more professional development in gifted education. I've done a lot of professional development in schools and working with teachers. One of my previous careers was a teacher in a school, so I know what it's like, at the chalk face or the whiteboard as it is now. So I get the need, and a lot of our professional teachers are going out there from their university degrees not knowing very much, if anything at all, about gifted education and twice exceptionality. It is growing. The more teachers do professional development, the more they learn about it, the more they're really interested in being inclusive in their classrooms and making sure that they're including gifted and twice exceptional students. When I used to do professional development in schools, probably 7, 8, 9 years ago, I used to get teachers to raise their hand and say, who here has heard of twice exceptionality? And I might get 1 or 2 out of a room of 50 or 60 teachers put their hand up. Now, when I ask that question, nearly all of the teachers put up their hands. So I feel that we are making some inroads and making a difference in schools. And I think the more teachers learn about these areas of giftedness and twice exceptional, the more they want to know. They're really eager to be supporting these learners. So one of the components or parts of twice exceptionality that I was talking about before is how we define giftedness or how we define talent. And this varies around the world. It's probably totally different in the Netherlands to what I'm going to be talking about here, or there might be some slight variations. There's a move more to talk about talent development as opposed to giftedness. That seems to be coming more to the fore within research. But here in Australia, we tend to have embraced this model. So the differentiating model of giftedness and talent, or the DMGT, which is by Francois Gagne, who's a Canadian psychologist. And he's had various iterations of this model over the years, and it seems to have, hit some kind of really core need in Australia in terms of how this is recognised. So I think it probably sits within the Australian culture in terms of explaining giftedness as a talent development process. So I'll just briefly explain this model. I've given you the link on this slide, and I'll share the slides with Eleanor afterwards to distribute to everybody. If you're interested in finding out more about his model, he's got a free website with lots of resources there. He came and did a presentation at the Griffith University Gifted Education Symposium last November, which he said was his final public presentation. So we were very lucky. That's on YouTube. I can also share the link to that if people are interested and would like to learn more about how he conceptualizes the differences between giftedness and talent. So as you can see in this visual representation here, his DMGT, his model of giftedness and talent, you can see on the left-hand side there in that sort of bluish colour, he's got what he calls aptitudes or gifts, and they're across those 6 different domains. So you've got intellectual, and then he's got a bit of an explanation about what that might look like: general intelligence, crystallized reasoning; creative, so music, movement, ideas, images; social, so persuasion, eloquence; perceptual, so relating to senses, vision, hearing; muscular, so about power and strength and speed; and then motor control is more about reflexes, agility, and those kind of things. So you can see covering lots of different areas that we traditionally talk about as being gifted. So anything relating to intellectual intelligence, being creative, being socially apt or socially aware, really, you think of a wine taster has really good sense of taste, and that kind of thing. But he talks about gifts as in they're the starting point. And then as to whether they turn into talents on the green side, on the right-hand side of this model, is this complex bit in the middle that he calls the developmental process that is enacted upon by what he calls catalysts. And there are two catalysts, so the environmental and the intrapersonal. So environmental is, things like money, status, parents, teachers, education. Are students, able to access programs that support their areas of giftedness? Are they able to access financial help, different facilities, different technologies, resources, all those kind of things? And then in the middle, we've got characteristics of the student themselves. So their traits, physical, mental, their goal management, whether they're motivated, whether they've got, autonomy over what they're doing. And then you've got that developmental process that brings all of those things together. And then, of course, sitting around that, you can see that little pink square. He's got chance in there. So that's the chance factor that impacts on whether giftedness actually develops into competencies or gift or talent on the other side. So imagine that you've got a very gifted athlete and, they're going to go and compete in a national competition, but something happens along the way. Perhaps they have an accident or unfortunately they break their leg. That's that chance factor impacting. So it's something that you can't control. It's just something that happens. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the competencies or the talents. So these are in fields, whereas giftedness is in domains. The difference here is that talent development. So areas like academics, languages, mathematics, sciences, arts, technical. So it might be something to do with, developing some kind of manufacturing, some new technology, connects with science and technology as well in terms of engineering, researching. The arts, we've got all the creative arts, musical, visual, performing, acting, dancing, and so forth. People services might be education, community, management and sales, business systems, probably could put AI in there at some point as well, and then sports and athletics and games. So this is the model that we've kind of embraced in Australia. It appears in most state and territory who have the policy documents. It appears in their policy documents. It appears as part of the Australian national curriculum. It isn't cemented in stone. So it's not like schools have to follow this model. They're able to, embrace any other definition or model of giftedness. What does happen, and what I've noticed in my research over the years, is there's often a disconnect between what's stated as a definition and policy and what's actually enacted in practice in schools and classrooms. So they might say we're looking at giftedness, so we're looking at these aptitudes or domains down the left-hand side, but what they're actually targeting is high achievement, which is actually talent. So they're not actually developing the talent, they're just wanting students who've got the talent already. And we see that quite often. And there's also a misunderstanding with regard to this model that it should happen in the years of schooling. So the 12 or 13 years that students are in schools, they begin with their aptitudes or gifts, or by the end, when they come out of the conveyor belt on the other end, they should be talented. That's a misunderstanding. It actually can take a lifetime to develop talents. And we see that quite often with, individuals who perhaps didn't do very well in school, but then go on to do some remarkable work throughout their lifespan. So I just wanted to give you that as a background to our understanding or our definition of giftedness in the Australian context. And that will introduce you to what I'm loosely calling a model of twice exceptionality. So you can see there on the right-hand side, giftedness, according to Gagne's model, because that's the model that we are generally using in Australia. And then on the left-hand side, we have disability, and that's drawn from or informed by the Australian Disability Discrimination Act. And also we have a piece of policy or legislation that sits under that, which is called the Disability Standards in Education of 2005, which states what schools and teachers should be doing within their schools and classrooms to support students with disability. So you can see here that we're kind of crudely bringing the two together to say twice exceptionality fits in the middle. But what I've found from some of my research is that there appears, and this is complex, so I'll repeat it in a couple of different ways, that you'll see there my sort of oval for twice exceptionality leans towards that yellow disability a bit there. And the reason for that is that my research is showing or indicating, and I've heard a few other researchers say this as well over the years, that there are more, or there appears to be a high proportion of gifted students in the population of students with disability than there are students with disability in the gifted population. So estimates are that there's between 20% to 36% more students who are gifted in the disability population than there are students who are with disability in the gifted population. So what does that tell us about, first of all, identifying these students, recognizing them, and then supporting them in developing their giftedness into talent, or whatever model you're taking in terms of talent development? What does that say if we're looking in the wrong place, or we're not looking in the right ways to identify our twice exceptional learners? So that was a really surprising and interesting finding from one of the projects I did back in 2020. It sticks in my mind because it was the time of the pandemic and it was very hard to conduct research during that time. But a really interesting indication. I wouldn't say it was a key finding, because I'm still working on looking at the prevalence of twice exceptionality within Australia, but more broadly. At the minute, I think it's probably sitting at about 7% in terms of an estimate of how many students we have who are twice exceptional, but I think that's a significant underestimation. As I said, it's looking at how we're identifying, what instruments we're using to identify students as twice exceptional. I think it's probably a lot higher than 70%. So we tend to be stuck in the disabilities or the conditions that students have. So that's the medicalisation of twice exceptionality that I talk about quite a lot in my work and my writing. I find that predominantly in Australia that teachers are really keen to support students who have disability that impacts on their learning. They want to know how they can support those students, but they find it very difficult to do both. How do I support the disability and also their giftedness? So these learners are often caught between the two categories. They don't fit within the traditional special education intervention remediation model, but they don't sometimes quite fit in the giftedness model either. So they're somewhere in the middle. And that really complicates provision and support for talent development in significant ways and makes the job of teachers very, very complex. And often they'll come to me with individual students and say, I've got a student who's doing this, that, and the other. I'm having problems with behaviour. I'm having problems finding how I can support them with this particular curriculum or topic areas that we're working on. And we usually will come up with some kind of plan to assist them, but this is without me actually seeing the child. So I'm just going off what the teacher would like to know what they can do to support the child. So teachers are very, very keen and very, very willing. Again, time poor. It takes a lot of time to often come up with strategies to support twice exceptional students and to move away from that deficit focus on remediation or interventions to look at what we're calling strengths-based approaches. So using the students' strengths, their areas of giftedness, their areas of interest, their areas of aptitude, their passions, to then address the areas where they might need extra support, writing, auditory processing, working memory, all those kind of things. So that medicalised model is still very influential in Australia. We have a national system where students with disability data is collected on the number of students with disability and the kind of supports they need, and then money is allocated, funding is allocated to education jurisdictions and schools based on that. So it's very much on the condition, the disability, the naming of that disability, and on the impact that it has on that child in terms of their learning. And that's where it's sitting at the moment. The concept of twice exceptionality hasn't got to policymakers, legislators, and governments yet. And if it did, I'm not sure that they would know what to do with it. So when we talk about areas of strengths, quite often be very divergent thinkers. So, thinking outside the box, as we might term it. So not converging on the one right answer. And they'll often see things that perhaps as a teacher you might not have even considered or thought about. Excuse me. High general intelligence, often an extensive vocabulary, really highly creative. And through my research, I've found that a lot of twice exceptional students who aren't necessarily engaged in school are doing a lot of really creative work outside school. So they might be producing their own movies, or doing their own short stories, or writing books, or doing artwork. You name it, they're thinking of it and doing it. So very inventive and love complex problems, or are really good at solving complex problems if they're interested. A lot of this hinges on whether they're interested, whether they've got that buy-in to whatever it is they want to do. And can be very focused on their areas of interest. And I'm sure as I'm talking, you probably can think of some twice exceptional students, or some students perhaps who are not identified yet as being twice exceptional, who might fit with some of these areas of strengths. So in terms of some areas of challenge, or what sometimes are called weaknesses, I don't like to use that sort of deficit language. So I think more of a challenge, it can often relate to areas like reading skills, auditory processing deficit. So this is not to do with the actual ears and the way they hear. It's how the brain is processing what the child is hearing. So if they're given verbal instructions, they quite often will forget what they've been asked to do. So, things like writing them on the board, or giving a list or a process to follow is a really good idea there. So it's sometimes a lagging behind of processing. So you might notice this with a student, or you're asking students a question and they're responding to the question. And then there might be a student who's put their hand up to answer a question, the second question you've asked, where they're still processing the first question that you asked, and their answer relates to the first question rather than the second question. And you might get giggles and some laughter from the other students, because they're like, oh, isn't that funny? Whereas this student's completely lost because they thought they were answering the question that they've just taken time to process, and didn't realize that you and the rest of the class have moved on. Things like attentional skills. I mean, you can probably see these relating to some disabilities already in terms of, conditions like ADHD, autism, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and so forth. Information processing issues, working memory issues is a big one for twice exceptional students. So this relates to holding information in your mind, in your working part of your mind, doing something with another bit of information, pulling that information that you've just kept in your working memory, and then coming out with something. So think of solving a maths problem where you've got to hold bits of information in your working memory as you're solving a problem. And quite often twice exceptional students will struggle quite a bit with working memory. So a lot of what we do is supporting them to develop these skills or find compensatory ways around doing things. So lots of different things in terms of helping with planning and organisation and those kind of things as well. What I have found too through my research over the years is that it's rarely one condition or one disability that twice exceptional students have. There's often what the medical and the literature calls comorbid conditions, so co-occurring conditions. And what I used to find was when there was investigations, what's happening with this child, they're struggling with this particular area, they would stop at one definition and go, okay, we know now, we can do this. But there was always something else going on. So, pushing to investigate further and, okay, what else is happening here? What else is happening here? And even if there wasn't an actual named disability, you might find that there was perhaps some issue with auditory processing, but it was not necessarily a formally diagnosed auditory processing disorder. And I wrote a recent article about that last year in the Roper Review based on one case study and the complexities that make up this one individual student that I was writing about called Ivan, in terms of everything that was going on and how it all meshed together and, how that went through his schooling and his education and the impact that had on him, not in terms of just achievement in school, but also making friends. That social emotional support is also really, really important. And twice exceptional learners can have a lot of issues with making friends and keeping friends, and that can leave them vulnerable to things like being bullied and being ostracized. So it's really important, and I've written an article about that as well. I've got some references at the end that I think most of them are freely available, and if anybody has problems, I'm more than happy to share them if you want to email me. But yeah, it's really important to be thinking about the social and emotional side of life for twice exceptional students as well. So on this slide, I wanted to give some visual to that complexity that I was talking about. So we look more holistically at giftedness now rather than a single IQ score. I'm not sure about how it is in the Netherlands, but in Australia, we have more of a holistic identification process of which IQ, psychometric assessment, forms a small but important part. So an example here is from a case study student who was aged 13 and a half at the time of the assessment. It was a WISC assessment. I think it was WISC 4 from memory, or it might be WISC 5. I can't remember. Actually, looking at it was a WISC 4. So you're probably really familiar with the IQ score distribution, the bell curve. So most people sit within that really dark blue area in terms of IQ score distribution, sitting on the sides of that 100 there. Going off to the right-hand side is what we call gifted traditionally, and going off to the left-hand side is what we would call special education populations or students with intellectual disability is the terms that we use here in Australia. So a student who sits on that left-hand side of an IQ of 70 or below would be, the definition would be that they would have an intellectual disability and probably need to go into a special education school to support them in their learning and their development, their growth. On the other side, we have a definition of giftedness, depending on whose definition you look at, could be from IQ of 130 and above. So taking Gagne's model that I shared with you before, he says the top 10% of aged peers recognized as gifted. The top 10% is generally above 130 IQ. Previously, he has talked about 120. And there's all those arguments about, you know, how culturally valid are IQ tests? What if somebody sits at 129 or 128? Are we going to say they're not gifted? So there are lots of problems with IQ scores. And, you know, I've done some work and some writing and some research around that. But for the purpose of explaining some of the complexity of one individual twice exceptional student, I think this visual is quite a good way of showing that. So let's start to have a look at some of the results or the scores on the WISC for this particular 13-and-a-half-year-old student. So you can see that little yellow star represents processing speed. So the processing speed was considered very low. So that's processing information. So you can imagine the impact and the impediment that would have in a classroom situation, in a learning environment. Then we've got that working memory that I talked about before. That's the red star there. So again, low. It's on the other side of 100. Then we've got visual spatial. So we're getting a little bit to sort of average at 105 here, and the green star. Then we've got a fluid reasoning that's sitting at 122. Which is getting up there towards that 130, so the blue star. And then our purple star is verbal comprehension, which is sitting at 144. So now we're looking at, you know, the gifted side of the IQ bell curve. So if we put this all together, we can start to see the complexity that impacts on an individual twice exceptional student on a daily basis in everything they're doing, in the classroom, in their home life, with their friends, with their family, and so forth. So there's a lot going on in terms of them trying to compensate for what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. So we've got this multi-exceptionality with the disabilities, and the impact of those is seen quite starkly here through these scores and the results that I've mapped onto the bell curve. So when we're talking about strengths-based for supporting our twice exceptional students, it's exactly that. We're focusing on both. So sometimes people call this feeding the gift, and that will bring up the areas that they're having challenge with. But we need to explicitly, quite often, teach skills to support planning, organisation, working memory, processing speed, because they don't come naturally, well, to a lot of students, but particularly so for twice exceptional students. So it's really important that we're looking at using evidence-based, research-informed ways of working. So pedagogical approaches, activities, interventions and support and accommodations in the classroom that will foster their strengths. I probably don't have time to go into a lot of detail about that, what they might look like, and I'm sure you have some ideas already of what you're doing to support students in the classroom. That's probably a presentation for another day. What I have found takes a lot of work is to get past the deficit focus and the deficit language that I think is probably rooted in really good intentions, but is not so much forward, future focused, strengths focused in terms of what we can do to support twice exceptional students. And that's where this research that I'm going to talk about now, I think, has shed some light on the reasons that might sit behind why that is happening. So when I asked both parents and students and separately teachers to tell me what they would say was strengths that twice exceptional students had, this is what they talked about in the next few slides. So the research focusing on twice exceptional learners and their strengths was about seeing what students and their parents recognized and valued about, you know, their themselves, the way they work, the way they are, their particular characteristics and so forth. And to see if there was a mismatch between strengths and recognition of those strengths and being able to address those strengths and challenges through the interventions that teachers are doing in the classroom and the support for these students. So you can see here, I've got various columns labelled with academic strengths, behavioural strengths, emotional strengths, and cognitive strengths. So the main areas that we talk about within classrooms that impact on learning and engagement and those kind of things. So what the students themselves and their parents said in terms of recognising their individual strengths in academics were things like interest. So interest came up time and time again: mathematics interest, reading interest, science interest, designing and making things. And then when we talked about behavioural strengths, it was about learning independently. So I like to learn independently. You know, I've got all these projects going on outside school that are my passion projects. Very self-directed and focused and love to investigate, really motivated, again, if we look at academics, in their areas of interest. So if it wasn't interesting, maybe not so motivated, maybe not so competent, maybe not so, self-directed. Emotional strengths often saw themselves as being self-confident, extroverted, having a really good sense of humour, and you can probably make some connections here with some characteristics of giftedness, and intrinsically motivated. So doing those passion projects outside school. And then the cognitive strength, creative, deep thinking, imaginative, lots and lots of diverse interests, really curious thinking, divergent thinking was one of the strengths I talked about before, inventing, and having good memories, which is interesting when you think about working memory. Then when I looked at teachers and I asked them what they saw as being strengths of twice-exceptional individuals, we had some commonalities and some areas of differences, again, grouped in those 4 headings. So academic strengths, reading skills, so that came up as the strength that the students recognise as well. Mathematical, good knowledge and recall of facts, good grades, which really surprised me because that's not what I often hear from parents and students about getting good grades. So that was an interesting one. And convergent thinking. So the opposite, not divergent, convergent. And the behavioural strengths on task, again, not something I hear very often. Excellent behaviour, not something I hear very often, but yeah, let's go with this. Their participation, they listen and respond, or their emotional strengths, so resilient. Now, that is something in previous research that I found they are very, very resilient. And again, probably a talk for another day. Positive attitude to learning in school, not what I hear from parents and students. Often they don't want to go to school, or they only want to go to school if something interesting is happening that day. And we have a phenomenon in Australia, I don't know if the same thing's happening in the Netherlands, of what's called school can't. It used to be called school refusal, but it was seen as sort of deficit language. But a lot of students, not just twice-exceptional students, but general population students not wanting to go to school. And it's become quite a big problem, and there's a lot more homeschooling happening where parents and carers can homeschool, but where they can't, the students are either not going to school or are forced to go to school, which is terribly sad. School should be a place of excitement and interest and learning and, doing all these wonderful things. So cognitive strengths, learning by choice, so that volition learning, being self-regulated, resilient, persistent, and showing agency. So then when I looked at differences in perception of the strengths, it was interesting, again, grouped in those 4 areas: academic, emotional, cognitive, behavioural. And you can see there, the students really and the parents emphasised under academic interests. So things that they were interested in, and those more broader skills like designing, creating, making, doing, a lot of practical hands-on stuff. Teachers tended to focus more on what was measurable. So grades, assessment outcomes, what they could actually measure in terms of factual recall and getting the right answer on tests and those kind of things. So the main differences around academic strengths were around for the students and parents, identifying those specific areas of interest or passion weren't often reflected at school in what was being assessed and how it was being assessed. Whereas teachers tended to recognise strengths that aligned with what they were assessing. So there's traditional ways of, what we do to give a grade at the end of a piece of work or the end of a semester or a year. Then in terms of emotional, the parents and the students focused on personal qualities. So things around having a really good sense of humour, being intrinsically motivated, self-driven, those kind of things. And then teachers tended to focus more on things like that positive attitude to school and being resilient, which is not necessarily a negative thing. It's really, really important. So there seemed to be more of a recognition by students and parents about emotional strengths that seemed to be more evident outside school than what the teachers were focusing on in terms of in school, which makes sense. Teachers are going to be focusing on academic engagement, on social engagement, on behavioural engagement, the students cognitively engaged and those kind of things. But it's really interesting to see the key differences here. So let's move on and look at cognitive. So that was, in terms of students and parents, was looking at that divergent thinking. So that complexity and problem solving, the new idea generation, being able to find things that others hadn't seen. So what we call that out of the box thinking, and being really innovative and curious and wanting to investigate things. And then the teachers were looking at the more cognitive engagement kind of skills, like setting goals and being able to respond to challenges as they came up in their learning, and really being self-regulated, which is quite often very hard for some twice-exceptional students. So the key differences there were around the students and parents looking more broadly at cognitive strengths. Those would are not necessarily directly related to academic work. And then the teachers were focusing on, of course, what's relating to the school curriculum. And then in terms of behavioural, parents and students were looking at independence, and then things like those intrinsic qualities about being self-motivated and so forth. And the teachers are tending to focus more on what's happening in the classroom, behavioural engagement in terms of being compliant, being on task, doing their work that they're supposed to be doing when they're supposed to be doing it. So there's some differences there between those behavioural strengths that parents and teachers were talking about, parents and students were talking about in being independent, as opposed to teachers looking at more at strengths behaviours that make their life a bit more easy, like classroom management and, being engaged in what they want the student to be doing, rather than having to respond to, behaviours that might be disruptive or challenging. So it's about how do we, put these two different things together in terms of what we're talking about with strengths. How do we address both perspectives? How do we bring those understanding of strengths together to be able to support students in the school and in the classroom? So I put together this table to compare the two. I won't go into too much detail because I unpacked this in the previous slide, but you can see it really clearly here across those four areas of academic, behavioural, emotional, and cognitive strengths. What the parents and the students were focusing on, the interest, the broader skills, self-direction, intrinsic qualities, self-confidence, so forth. And then the teachers was very much more measurable. What can I measure in terms of grades and outcomes? Are they emotionally self-regulated in the classroom? Are they doing what I want them to be doing? So I thought, well, what are some potential reasons for these differences? And of course, context is very important. So the classroom is totally different context to outside school and home, and what's recognised and what's done there. And we saw that in the focus in terms of, the orientation to compliance, excuse me, in the classroom, and grades, and then out of the classroom more pursuing passions and interests. And it was not an extrinsic reward. It doesn't matter because they weren't going to be graded. They didn't want to be graded. It was something that they were doing for themselves. So really intrinsically motivated there. And that, of course, relates to that measurement criteria of what the outcomes are going to be and what the goals and priorities are. So if we're talking about using strengths-based, how do we do that? What does it look like? How can this research inform what we do in the classroom? How do we manifest the strengths and use that depth of understanding from this work to actually leverage each twice-exceptional learner's unique strengths? So I drew out some areas around various particular parts, so learning, engagement, achievement, and then social and emotional well-being, and what some positive implications and challenges might be in those regards. So beginning with learning, looking at what we could do, if possible, to be more holistic in terms of what we're doing. How and in what ways can we bring in students' interests? Are there areas of the curriculum where we can do that? Oh, well, we're already doing that to a certain extent. Are there areas where we could expand that, or, leverage their skills, their giftedness, their knowledge, and get them to participate and engage in a way that is different to what we're actually doing now? And then, of course, there's some challenges relating to that as well, in terms of things like excelling in different activities, those creative activities, things that perhaps are not available in school. And going back to Gagne's model in terms of those resources and facilities and so forth. Then we're looking at engagement. So engagement has all its different dimensions to it. Again, a talk for another day. But when we're looking at engaging and learning, again, the interest, the intrinsic motivation, and then the challenges associated around that is that disconnect between what's happening outside school and what's happening inside school, and how can we leverage those outside school strengths and areas that the students are actually working, engaging with, to bring that into school and what we're doing in the classroom. And time again, the term boredom comes up from twice-exceptional students that I work with. I'm bored in school. And as teachers, we don't like that term, because that means that, what we're offering, they're seeing as boring. So we have to try and drill down. What do they mean by boring? What are they bored with? And sometimes that's an impossible challenge, but I quite often, if we have the time and if we have the space to actually talk to some of our twice-exceptional students individually and ask them what they're struggling with and what would they see would help. I think there's a lot of value in that. Obviously, it's got to be if they're able to do that in terms of, their development and their age and stage of where they're at. But I think we can get a lot of insight from twice-exceptional learners themselves in terms of what helps them and what supports them in the classroom. My son, my now adult son, twice-exceptional, he always had tremendous insight about what would help him in school. And I find that time and again with the twice-exceptional students that I work with, that they have really good insight what works and what doesn't work for them in the classroom. In terms of achievement, some implications that are positive, looking at those non-traditional strengths that the parents and the students are recognising in terms that were sort of a bit opposite or quite different to what the teachers were recognising. And then around the understanding of the potential, and this is probably something that plays out in gifted education and talent development more broadly, it's about raising expectations. And sometimes I hear teachers inadvertently say, oh, that child's gifted, but why are they doing that? They can't possibly be gifted if they're doing that. It might relate to the state of a child's handwriting, or it might relate to where they're problem solving, or why don't they show they're working out when they're doing a mathematics problem? And, we've got answers for a lot of that. Then some challenges relate to things like the discrepancy between school grades and students' actual capabilities. And I was really surprised, as I mentioned before, to find that teachers saw twice-exceptional students as achieving high grades, because that's the opposite of what I see. And that's opposite of what I see on their school reports and their school grades. So it was a really interesting one that I didn't get a chance to delve deeper into it, but it would be interesting to find out what's going on there. And then social and emotional well-being, really important. The positive implications around recognising those emotional strengths that were articulated from the children and their families, and then how they can be fostered in the classroom, in inclusive classrooms. And then some challenges around misunderstanding, and that's misunderstanding the student themselves and their intentions, and sometimes the way they articulate and use verbal language, sometimes in particular, and their affect, it might not quite fit with the expectations of the receiver, the person who's listening, or their friend's teacher. And sometimes that leads to some misunderstandings and some problems that were not intentional. And we see that a lot with twice-exceptional students who might have part of their profile of autism spectrum disorder. Anxiety is a big problem for twice-exceptional students. I've done some separate research around all of the students in one particular project I was in all had comorbid anxiety, and it was hard to see if the anxiety came before school or if it was a result of what was happening in school. So that research, when I was looking at, prior to going to school, they didn't seem to be very anxious as children, but then once they started school and the impacts of their challenges or areas of disability and giftedness didn't quite fit into the expectations of some classrooms, that created a lot of stress and feelings around anxiety and led to social difficulties and so on. So it's about really foregrounding their strengths within the classroom environment so the peers are recognising their strengths as well. So an example of that, in one particular school, they had one child was very gifted in and interested and passionate about rocks, like different types of rocks, metamorphic rocks, sedimentary rocks, and so forth. And they were doing a particular unit of work on this topic, and the teacher said, well, I'll get this child to do a presentation. And I was in the classroom when the child did the presentation. Amazing. He challenged the students and asked them whether rocks sink or float. So I had a bucket of water and, clear bucket of water. Do they rock, sink or float? Doing experiments, rocks are sinking, rocks sinking. The students are going to say, yeah, of course rocks are going to sink. He had a piece of pumice. I don't know if you know what pumice is, but it comes out of volcanic rock, and it's full of air pockets or holes, and it floats. So it's a rock, but it actually floats. And the students then got to see this particular twice-exceptional student in a whole new light. This student that they've been, sort of picking on and bullying a little bit because, can't do things, with terrible handwriting or, now seen in a totally different light. And, there's other ways of doing that, of course, but that was a particular poignant example that stayed with me. Teacher-student relationships really important around addressing those misunderstandings and having strong connections. And I find if twice-exceptional students have one particular teacher or a couple of particular teachers that they gel with, that they connect with, who they can go to when they're having problems and who are supportive, it can be very important, and that can address barriers to attending school and to engaging in school and actually being in school. It's developing those kind of relationships in a way that are really supportive for a key personnel at the school. And then, of course, curriculum instruction, some positive implications there around the flexibility to accommodate strengths, and then engaging them with their particular interests. And then, of course, some challenges around that, depending on the syllabus and the curriculum. Is that possible? And in what ways do we do that? It's going to be individual and different for each child, but with some commonalities across Twice-Exceptional Learners. So I can see that time is marching on, so I'll draw a conclusion here, just to say that probably the term multi-exceptional learners is becoming more accurate rather than twice, because twice implies the two, gifted and disability, where it's a lot more complex than that in terms of the intersectionalities of all those exceptionalities and how they impact on each individual student on any particular part of any day. And really engaging their strengths and moving beyond deficit perspectives. So I'd like to finish on that note. Thank you for having me.
Well, Michelle, it's not thank you for having me, but it's a big thank you from us to you, because I think there was a wonderful presentation. I noticed that there were some questions in the chat, and I think you might be happy to answer them. People who are interested in a bit of interaction, feel free to turn on your camera. However, be aware that this is recorded, so you obviously have to agree to the fact that this video will be published online. If not, only ask your questions via the chat. I'm going to the chat and see what's going on, because our first question goes back way to the start of your presentation, where you had that Venn diagram on 2E and giftedness. And Annemieke asked a question, you have that additional part on the left-hand side. And she says, would it be possible that you also have a part on the right-hand side, because that amongst the group of gifted learners, there might be learners who will not be recognized as having a learning disability. Fugate indicates that his research found that amongst a group of ADHD gifted learners, there are learners who might not have been recognized in the regular population of gifted learners. Can you just, question might be longer than the option for you to answer the question.
Yeah, absolutely. That model was actually just for twice exceptionality, so it wasn't considering broader population. But exactly what I said about there being more students who are gifted in the disability population than students with disability, gifted in the disability than disability in the gifted, would of course go for general classrooms. So students who aren't identified for either the masking effect that often comes up as a theory in the field, aren't identified for either giftedness or disability, are identified for giftedness but not disability, or are identified for, I forgot what I've said now, it's getting to the end of the day, aren't recognised for one but are recognised for other, or not recognised for either. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I go to the next question. Annemieke, you have to wait until I've addressed all the questions in the chat, and then come back again. Alan asked the question, is part of the problem that not that most IQ tests are not suited for 2E learners? Sometimes IQ tests are even used to give an indication of ADHD, ASD. If it were me to answer it, I would say IQ tests are not invented to identify a learning disability. However, if you look at the profile that you see, it might give an indication as, hey, there's something different with this learner that we might need to explore a little bit further. But that might be more your expertise than mine.
Oh no, definitely, I concur. They're one part of the big picture, and probably 20 years ago, I was very against IQ tests, because I'm like, why should one score represent what somebody can or can't do? Of course, it's only at that particular point of the test that it relates to if somebody's had a bad night's sleep or they haven't eaten or they're irritable. It's going to impact on the test. Disability is going to impact on the test. But exactly what you said, Eleanor, they give an indication of something else potentially going on that is worth investigating. So, for example, the case study student that I showed you in the bell curve slide,
Yes.
Working memory is an indication potentially of other disabilities conditions, that there are other assessments and tests that a really good psychologist will then look at using with that particular child to help determine what's happening and then formulate a plan or help to formulate a plan with their school, with their teacher, about what kind of accommodations and adjustments can be done for that particular student that are bespoke to that particular student. So of course there are broad accommodations, and then there are more specific accommodations, speech to text software, all those kind of things that we talk about that can be done, adjusting learning, things as straightforward as closed captions, wearing headphones for students who are distracted by extraneous noise in the classroom, ways to support student who's got processing speed issues or an auditory processing issue. Lots of different ways to support students, and that's so a lot that can be done.
I really thought that the slide with the bell curve, where you explicitly made the differences, the interpersonal differences, visual on the students' test, might come in as very helpful for teachers to see, because if they only see the numbers, they see the numbers. And they can interpret them, but having them on that bell curve made it very clear. The last question was from Suzanne, and she said, don't a lot of the interventions count for all gifted learners? What is special for 2E learners? And if I look at research, but again, you might want to give some other information. As far as I know, there are non-interventions known that are only a match for twice-exceptional learners, and there are no interventions known that are invented for either being gifted or or having a learning disability, that are only effective for that group. So there is not one set that is specifically for them. It all depends on the learner's profile, but
that's right. Yeah, absolutely. It's very individual. It's very bespoke to a particular student, and that's why I've changed over the years to be more in favor of some kind of psychometric assessment, because it gives an insight and depth to a student's profile that might not otherwise be forthcoming through standardized tests or other things that we do. So a really good psychologist will be able to tease out what's happening from those subtest scores and write a report that's very informative to teachers. And again, a talk for another day, but interpreting those reports is really, really important for gifted students as well as twice-exceptional students and all other students.
Okie dokie. This is where I'm going to stop the recording. For those of you who want to share or spend another 5 or 10 minutes with Michelle and me, feel happy to stay online. But this is where I'm going to end the recording, because I noticed that some people would love to have the opportunity for a quick chat, but let's do that without the recording. Again, Michelle, on behalf of the Dutch National Knowledge Centre of Gifted Education, I'm really pleased that you were joining us. You gave at least 2 opportunities for me to get back to you to a second and third presentation all over the next year. And I thought, okay, you gave some indications as in this might be something for a whole presentation. And then I thought, let's just be Dutch and blunt. We're going to ask you to come back. This is where the recording stops.